All gather back, please. Are we missing anybody from the committee? Where's Councillor Koneccia? Ah, there he is. Okay. Yeah, Councillor, here he comes. Here you go, guys. Right. Councillor, if we can actually take your seat, please. Thank you. Okay. Can we make sure that the webcast is back on, please? Okay, I've requested that the webcast go back on, okay, and we'd like to just move forward. We have two more speakers, okay. The first one I'd like to call is Stafford Napier, please. Hello, Stafford, lovely to see you, okay. I've got 2 minutes on my phone, okay. And your time will start when you start speaking. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. Good evening, members. This is going to be very short, very sweet. I'm going back to basics, really. I obviously have on this memory stick all the appendices that came to us all. And I think they're quite a dangerous document because they give all sorts of hostages to fortune. And really, this is going to shoot yourselves in the foot. I've got in my mind a sort of scenario where perhaps our MP or certainly the leader of the council sitting down with the Secretary of State and pleading all the exceptional circumstances which are all spelt out in the minutes from your meetings in March as to why the numbers should not be at 880 DPA. And I can see a civil servant slapping down the table the documents that you've got in front of you and saying, here is a document that says you can produce 880 DPA and how you can achieve it. And indeed, Basingstoke, you've been producing much more than that over the last few years, so let's put it up to 1,000 DPA. That's because this document gives you all those reasons. And the only caveat that is in there is buried in Appendix 1, where it simply says that the council has significant concerns about the housing numbers and considers that the borough is likely to have exceptional circumstances. It's just buried, one sentence there. So I think the solution for this, as this is in the public domain now, is that you have to ask the team to go back and spell out somewhere in those documents why these numbers these sites, and many of the sites, perhaps not all, but certainly many of them, just cannot be delivered for all the reasons that are in there, like heritage, loss of the best and most versatile agricultural land, the foul water transfer and treatment. And remember, most of these houses will transfer their wastewater to the Loddon. The compromising of green policies and the environmental and landscape impact. I think you have to ask the officers to put something in there that gives a bit of cover. Otherwise, you will be lumbered with this because you have a document which says you can deliver them. That's it.
Thank you, Mr. Napier. Are there any questions for Mr. Napier? Any questions? No? That's great. Thank you very much. Okay. If you could wipe down, please. Okay. Thank you. Okay, for our final speaker, and I'll call forward Paul Beavers, please. Okay, Mr. Beavers, thank you very much. It's good to see you here tonight. Okay, you've got 2 minutes, okay, starting from when you start speaking.
These comments address shortcomings in the spatial strategy for green infrastructure across the town, and particularly in the southwest. Why does Council have a policy EM2 on strategic gaps that randomly but unambiguously map settlement policy boundaries to protect settlements, but refuses a policy that maps protections for green infrastructure corridors, ancient woodlands and priority habitats to protect and enhance the environment as Cabinet claims it wants to do in the Council plan? Why no map showing all these environmental assets in relation to all proposed sites, so residents and councillors can judge? You have the data. How can wildlife cross spaces and otherwise disperse and thrive when all we have is a flawed vision for southwest Basingstoke and a spatial strategy overall that substantively ignores the council plan? narrowing or closing off opportunities for nature? Why? Waiting until a developer submits their plans is too late. For over 10 years, this council has failed to take substantive planning action to protect and enhance the environment. And I hope this committee will say for this update, enough is enough. B&DBC has a green infrastructure strategy that outlines the opportunity for a wildlife corridor from the North Wessex AONB to the South Downs National Park. The council ignores it. The vision for the South West and the illustrative master plan from the Manydown project and merchant venturers shows the council is intent on closing off the last remaining opportunities for corridor connectivity, including around Junction 7, but also the underpass beneath the M3 at Tower Hill Dummer that joins the A30 and could transit north. This would be a feasible, almost cost-free route for wildlife. Why not in the spatial strategy? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Beaver. Does anybody have any questions for Mr. Beaver? Councillor McCormack, please.
Thank you, Chair. Just interested in what you mentioned about settlement policy boundaries, but also, would you want to see a policy about green corridors and how we can expand going out of the area of Basingstoke and Dean to try and protect our wider countryside from coalescence?
Thank you very much. Councillor Cubitt, please.
Sorry, I can vividly remember there's a map in the green infrastructure where there's a big long, there's lots of, it's pink and green, and it's got all the connectivity there. So we've got all the evidence to do it. We just don't do anything we say we're going to do.
That's for the...
Thank you very much. Are there any more questions for Mr. Beavers? No? Mr. Beavers, thank you very much. Okay, so that concludes all the speakers for this evening. Thank you very much. Okay, and now move on to the local plan update. Okay, and I'd like to hand over to Councillor Ganesh so he can introduce the reporter's portfolio holder.
Thank you, Chair. Good evening, everyone. This is the local plan update that sets out the strategy for the delivering suitable growth in the borough in coming years. The report sets out the proposed draft spatial strategy and policies to deliver growth based on the available evidence and the standard method, the housing figure. So this is a great opportunity for EPH, like the last EPH we've had, for the members to give the feedback and express their concerns or whatever the feedback they have, so that can be taken on board, similar to the one we've had in the past. So we've listened to the speakers, the great 2.5 hours. So it's a great opportunity for members to give their view, and I would like to welcome the officers, and thanks for all the work put towards it, and introduce the paper. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Just before we move on to Joe, committee, it's recommended that the contents of this report are noted. Okay, that any views expressed to the committee are reported to the portfolio holder for planning and infrastructure for consideration prior to the publication of the draft Regulation 18 consultation. Okay, so Joe. There's nothing to be said. Okay. Does anybody have any initial comments? I know I have one comment that I'd like to bring forward, which is kind of the big elephant in the room. Okay, and why, after we have had a motion at full council, and why, after having a motion here, okay, in this committee, are we sticking with the standard method housing figure of 17,820?
Thank you, Chair. The report is written in line with the Cabinet decision that was taken in March. So to continue with the plan making at this time, that we would continue for Regulation 18 using the standard method in light of government advice. However, it's very much taken on board, obviously, the Council's view on this and how we feel about the housing number. So work is progressing on that alongside that and making this exceptional circumstances case. And the Regulation 18 is an opportunity to really investigate that with all stakeholders, to really see what the views are, to ensure that we're making sure that all the constraints are properly considered. This is very much at Regulation 18, a draft stage of plan making. So there are obviously comments about why the evidence base isn't finished in all ways. That's because we are still at the early stages. There are opportunities now to get everybody's views across the board from all areas and different interests, so that we can amend the plan in terms of numbers, sites, etc. So it's really about going out and testing it at this stage. That is why. In terms of kind of the census that's coming out, that whole position is very much acknowledged. We've got experts lined up for when that census information comes out later on in June to look at that and consider whether we've got exceptional circumstances and the way forward in terms of whether it's suitable to do additional modelling. Picking up on some of the speakers' case points that they made about the Chelmer model and other models, that we would look at that based on the census information. From our perspective, it's too early to run those models at the moment because of the government guidance. Once we've got the census, we can relook at that. So we're very much on board to be doing that and progressing that argument. So that's why the paper is written in the way that it is.
Thank you. Okay. I propose to go through the paper section by section rather than page by page, just to kind of make it a bit easier. Okay. And so we can get comments. So, sorry, Councillor Cubitt.
Before we start approaching the paper, can I just touch on the exceptional circumstances, please? In the last meeting that I was not on the committee for, on the 3rd of March, there was a whole section on exceptional circumstances. And unless I'm not reading this correctly, it could not have been made more clear that the exceptional circumstances will not be able to be made for us to not build lots of houses, because you make references to paragraph 61, paragraph 11, and then you go through in March the reasons why exceptional circumstances won't wash and that we have to continue with the standard model. So I'm just wondering why, in view of what you've put in the documentation on the 3rd of March, what additional information you will use to demonstrate exceptional circumstances in the you're hoping to use.
So the comments in the March committee about exceptional circumstances to relate to paragraph 61 of the MPPF and the PPG tests, which are quite specific in terms of the actual data that you use. So we have had experts look at that, and from their view is that there are not exceptional circumstances in terms of the very narrow exceptional circumstances set out in the PPG about the data. So that's what that kind of report is saying. Based on that, when you're looking at housing need, at the moment, we're of the view that we should be using the standard method, and there's not a reason not to have that as your starting point. That may very well change when the census information comes out, because that, at the moment, is obviously all based on predictions, whereas this will give us the actual data properly in terms of what's actually happened, so we can look at that in more detail. That's a different argument to paragraph 11, which talks about what our housing requirement should be. So the standard method sets our need figure, but then you look through all the constraints and things that actually will give you the case of why you cannot meet that needs figure. So that whole case is being developed in terms of what our constraints are. So there's two sides to it. Local exceptional circumstances, is as a phrase in terms of the technical side of things, is quite narrow, but we're looking at it much more broadly than that.
Any supplementaries on that? Any supplementaries on that, Councillor McIntyre?
Yeah, just because we're talking about it now. The experts that you've had to look at this, are you aware of any other examples of where any other authority has deviated from the standard method?
I mean, there are a number of authorities that are looking at that and are going through the process of doing so. I think the only area authority, it's kind of an authority that we know about, is one in London, which was a slight difference of authority. And that was because in that particular circumstance, they didn't have available data that met their boundary. So one of the tests in the PPG is that you don't have available data for your borough or your area. So they had a specific case to run. I think they're the only ones that we know about, and obviously that's not the case here.
Thank you. Okay, any more questions very quickly? Okay, Councillor McCormack and then Councillor Cubitt.
Thank you, Chair. So I was just looking to try and see if we have confirmation of the total number of houses in this report, because some of the individual very large schemes, the numbers have changed since we last looked at it. So, for instance, Manydown has been bumped up to 4,000 houses, and the two schemes that constitute Manydown South have been rounded down by 2,000 houses to 7,500 houses. So could I get some confirmation of what the revised total is? And also, that's my first question. The second question relates to a comment that was made just now, where it seemed to me that we might be looking at including the 2021 census data. Is that going to be the case? And my third one, which is
sorry, can we just answer one question at a time, please, just so we can get a
right. Okay. Well, there's two to be going on with, and I do have a third one. Thank you.
In terms of the numbers that are in the report, you're right that some of the allocation numbers have changed. In terms of the numbers that would be over the plan period, so for example, for Manydown it's 2,200 rather than 7,500. That's the wider site. In terms of the numbers for the actual plan period, it's about 7,000 that's shown in here. So it's about 6,000 in terms of allocations, and then just under 1,000 in terms of the rural areas.
Okay, what about the second question? Was that answered?
Well, it was more. It was alluded to that we might be using the 2021 census data. Is that likely to be the case? That was a request that was generated earlier on in the year at our meetings.
The census information hasn't been released yet. It will be released in stages. So the first set of data will be released on the 28th of June. So at that point we will look at it to see what it shows in terms of exceptional circumstances.
Sorry, and your third question, Councillor McCoy.
Yeah, Manydown South stretches from Kempshot to Oakley and North Waltham, and there's a watershed running down the middle of it. How much of Manydown South will drain into the test basin, given that what we know about the water study, and I quote page 21 water study report about nitrates, ammonia from sewage likely to primarily transform to nitrate in aerobic ground conditions, and various other aspects of the water study that suggests that we should not be draining, building houses that drain into the test basin, especially at the head of the test basin, as Councillor Phillimore mentioned the test rises at Dean. So how much of Many Down South does drain into the test basin? Has anybody actually looked at it? And if it does drain into the test basin and we're wanting to build it, then does that suggest we're going to be having to pump our wastewater over the watershed, as was proposed and currently is the default scheme for the golf course, and yet we've run into trouble with the implementation of that? We said, let's build 1,000 houses, and now Thames Water are saying we can only have about a third of that total. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, I can try and help with the question on Many Down and the watershed. The issue of whether they have to demonstrate nutrient neutrality depends on the way where the wastewater is treated and where it's discharged to. My understanding is that there have been discussions with Thames Water that that development will be treated by Basingstoke, so that will ultimately go to the Loddon, which ultimately ends up in the Thames estuary. So it wouldn't be required to demonstrate nutrient neutrality. It's only if the wastewater treatment discharges are going into the test catchment.
Do you have a supplementary, Councillor McCormick?
Well, it doesn't sound like any consideration has been given to the problems that we already have with the golf course in that case. Has any consideration been given to that? Are Thames Water willing to foot the price for that, bearing in mind that they've signally failed to do so with the golf course? To me, that suggests that this site's a non-starter.
I understand there have been early discussions with Thames Water about achieving that, and they haven't, well, I'm not aware of issues having been raised, but the discussions are ongoing.
Thank you. Councillor Cubitt, please.
Just a couple of things. In the government.uk plan making guide, it says we encourage authorities to publish documents to form part of their evidence base as they are completed, rather than waiting for the options to be published. And what we're about to do tonight is we're about to discuss the options, but we haven't got all the evidence. And I've been, together with a number of other members, been asking for a transport assessment, and I've been asking for the water cycle study. And of course, as we all know, we received the water cycle study 2 weeks ago, and we haven't had any debate on it. And it is very clear to me and to a number of other members that the water cycle study is not fit for purpose. And I alluded to the fact that I think it's intellectually a pretty dishonest document, and I stand by that. It's very clear that it looks like it's been retrofitted, so the SimCat modelling in the appendix like jars so profoundly with the rest of the document. It was such an obvious adjunct, which is exactly why in February last year we didn't get it, and we've been waiting for 1.5 years for the modelling, and the modelling is all based on desktop study. So my point is, it couldn't be clearer that government says the evidence needs to inform what is in the plan and shape its development rather than being collected retrospectively. So I would like your comments on why you think this document that we're discussing tonight is relevant to us, the members, in view of the fact that we haven't got the evidence that forms the options that you're proposing tonight.
I mean, the first point of it is that we are still at an early stage. So it's something that we keep saying, that this is an iterative process. So the evidence base will evolve as the plan evolves. That's natural. That's always what happens with plan making. What we have got is all of the evidence base in place that we consider is necessary at this stage. So on the website, there's a whole raft of technical evidence-based documents, which range from landscape assessments, for example, housing market assessment, economic needs assessment. There's a whole raft there, none of which have been brought in detail to the EPH committee, because they are receiving reports which summarise the outcomes of those studies and the implications of them. As you said, they're very much technical reports, all of them, and it's always been the case through this process that we've considered that it would be not suitable to bring very technical reports to this committee, because there are literally so many of them. That is the process that we've used, like the Members Advisory Panel and other ways of doing that, getting the information out there. but that will continue to develop. In terms of particular studies such as the transport assessment, that I know members are concerned about, and yes, you're absolutely right, in the past with the last local plan, we had a very detailed transport assessment, which we will have again later on in the process. What the transport assessment does is it doesn't look at different options, it assesses your final plan. So it assesses your final number and your final allocations. So that's what you do sort of towards the end of it, rather than doing modelling on lots of different options. So this is the opportunity through the Reg 18 to get the views on the numbers and the sites to then inform a more formal plan that we would look at with a TA. So that's kind of looking at your iterative process. What we have got appended to the report is where we are with the transport assessment so far. So that looks at an impact review. So it shows you what the impacts are of the sites that we've got in there at the moment, and identifies a number of junctions and areas that need further work, and that will take place as we evolve. And hopefully by the time we get to Regulation 18, we'll have more information on that. So there's a number of points of why we've taken the approach that we have. And so the water cycle study is a very technical document, and it's debatable about whether that should be debated in the committee.
So I hear you. I look at the evidence that we had last time round, and it strikes me as very peculiar that statements that were made, and I've got all of it in front of me, for why certain sites were not suitable, according to the Environment Agency, and according to our experts that we hired last time. And I've got various documents, you know, like the local plan transport assessment by Parsons Brinkerhoff, where they did look into all options before the sites were selected. So they did run through loads of modelling, including the Western Bypass. And I look at the landscape capacity studies of yesteryear, and I look at the commentaries that are now being made to the sites that we're going to discuss tonight. And there's been a mammoth change in experts' opinions, and that's the problem that all of us are faced with, is that you make references to these technical assessments, and how is it that technical assessments that came to one conclusion in 2009 come to complete volte-face today? You know, and how are we going to deal with that?
I mean, each bit of evidence base has to be done at that point in time. So I don't know what you're specifically alluding to, but it will reflect the current position with that.
No, but I'm talking, okay, so I'm not trying to put you on the spot here, but I'm talking about flood risks and landscape. They haven't changed. Heritage sites haven't changed. They haven't moved. Park Pale still exists. Flooding still happens. These are things that haven't changed, and yet we now have completely opposite, opposing views.
Those constraints that you've mentioned, yes, some of them haven't changed, some of them may have, in terms of we've got an up-to-date sequential test, for example, we've got an up-to-date strategic flood risk assessment, so we do update some of the data, some of it, as you said, won't change. The process that we have already gone through, and this relates to the transport assessment that you've quoted there from Parsons Brinkerhoff, is that we've done a detailed site assessment process, and that has looked at the highway impacts at that level that you've had there, and that information was reported to this committee back in September when we looked at the shortlisted sites. I think you'll remember that we had an appendices that was about 600 pages long with all of the very detailed criteria for every site with all of the colours, which looked at highway impact as one of 30-odd criteria. So we've looked at the evidence base, we've done that assessment, and we've brought that to committee, and that's why you've got your shortlisted sites. So that information is not replicated in this report because that's already been discussed.
Thank you very much. Just before we go any further, it's just approaching 9:30. I would like the committee's permission to suspend standing orders and move on to, say, 10 o'clock at this particular time, with a view of discussing any further business afterwards then regarding the extension of hours. Can I have a show of hands for those who wish to suspend standing orders or agree to suspend standing orders and go on till, say, 10 o'clock? Okay, thank you very much. That's unanimous. Okay. No, it's okay. I've got it. Okay. So just moving on very, very quickly, okay, we do have an expert on the water cycle study, and I know it's taken it out of step, but can we have a look at section 8 with the emerging evidence-based studies? It's page 47 or 21 of 27, okay, where we have the water cycle study in 8.1, okay, through to 8.6. And I'd like to know if anyone on the committee has any viewpoints or any questions on that while we have the expert here. Councillor McCormick.
Yeah, what's changed between 2009 and 2022? There seems to be very different conclusions arrived at with the River Loddon.
Since the previous water cycle study, there have been improvements to the wastewater treatment works at Basingstoke and Sherburn St John, which has meant tightening of phosphate controls, which has improved the situation in some of them. And there's the potential for it to be further improved. Wastewater treatment work with regards to phosphates, the technology has improved, and so permits can be tightened to further improve the treatment.
Well, I understand that scientifically phosphates may be cause for concern, but in the court of public opinion, it's the discharge of raw sewage into the rivers that has ignited the public's ire, and I don't see any evidence presented in this report that will assuage those concerns. So that is based on the fact that the 2009 water study did flag those issues, and we know from what residents have said at previous instances of this committee when we've met, that these discharges have happened, and we've had evidence from the Environment Agency that these are at an unacceptably high level. So it seems complete madness to have a water cycle study that appears to dismiss these concerns in the base of tangible evidence that suggests that we should not be building and risking further discharges without some significant extra investment, which doesn't appear to be forthcoming.
Thank you. Storm overflows are included in the modelling for the River Loddon, and my understanding is that with the Environment Act there's tighter standards on there's targets for improvements and reductions, significant reductions in storm overflows and spillages. The drainage and wastewater management plans that are currently being drafted have got are expected to cover that issue and set out reduction targets for that. It's also my understanding that in the price reviews, there's to reflect the Environment Act that the government is putting higher priorities on storm overflow improvements or reductions in them and spillages generally.
Okay, thank you. So, Councillor Slimming, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm very interested in the water cycle report, and a number of people have already alluded to the fact it's come at very short notice, and most of us haven't probably had the chance to digest it totally, and also that it isn't actually referred to in the papers this evening. In fact, you have to find it on the website and go and have a look at it through that. There are several concerns that I have in the fact that we are now in 2022, and from the year 2000 onwards, there's been indication that we really need to look very carefully at how we manage water and the amount of water that we have in this area. Across the whole of South East, we're already in significant water deficit. Most people don't realise that, in fact, we've got less water available to people than in many parts of the places where they have deserts. And I think people just think because it rains, it's going to automatically be usable. Thames Water in particular, and it doesn't say in our report, our paperwork particularly, that Thames Water actually supply the majority of the water supply to Tadley, only parts of it of Southern Water, and that's not clear in the papers that I read earlier this year. So Thames Water are unable to supply some of the areas with the high pressure in Tadley. That has been the case for many years. Sewage is already a problem, not only discharging into rivers, but discharging into people's homes when it rains, and when it rains considerably. And that most of you here probably weren't old enough to remember, or maybe you were children, in 1976, when we had obviously significant shortage of water, including bowsers in the street. And having just left the Environment Agency, where I worked with Thames Water very closely on climate change and plans for drought orders, I think most people would be surprised that practically every year we have been looking at the significant prospect of that happening now, not just in 1976. I'm quite concerned that we haven't had an opportunity to perhaps cross-reference the water cycle report and what criteria it was given to the people who produced it, and whether or not we could have an opportunity to cross-examine them. I think that might have been quite appropriate for us to have actually been able to do that, so that we could look a bit more in detail about what that report actually says. And as far as what we call demand management and looking at retrofitting homes, should I say that basically I feel this council has lost the plot on that. The Environment Agency produced a report on retrofitting in 2000, which actually said that people should be encouraged to put those things in houses as they're being built. I'm not sure that the houses that have been built since 2000 have in fact all had the things that are being recommended now. And are you going to try and retrofit all those homes that have been there beforehand to encourage people? Thames Water tried very hard to encourage people to put water systems, hippos in their tanks and obviously move on. It is a very difficult thing to persuade people to change what they've already done. And 110 litres of water per day, I now wonder whether that figure is correct here. A lot of people now aren't commuting to London, where there is a big water shortage. They're now working at home, and therefore the amount of water they're probably using at home is increased. I don't think that's been taken into account either. In 1976, as I said, we had a water shortage, and we should have really been doing some of this beforehand. I think this council has been sleepwalking, basically, in what they could have done and what they could have done already and what they now need to do. I think they need to wake up and smell the coffee, or perhaps the sewage. So I certainly think that they should actually seriously consider whether or not these plans in the water cycle about retrofitting are something that we can depend on to deliver the amount of water and the amount of sewage disposal that's going to be required for the housing that we're currently talking about. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Sermon. Is there any comments?
Thank you. Yeah, the water cycle study does consider water supply, and you're correct, we are in an area of severe shortage and water stress. It looks at the water resource management plans and whether that takes into the projected growth for our area. And the plans do conclude that though they have taken the growth into account, and that's considered in their projections. So water resource management plans do have a plan for how to supply sufficient amounts of water. That does include demand management measures. And my understanding is that both Southern Water and South East Water, that's supported by strong customer support for that, preference over other schemes that may have to be implemented as alternatives. So the report doesn't have to, in terms of the actual water supply, that is covered by the water resource management plans that says there's sufficient. The report does go further by considering what options we could take to ensure that all the development would result in a water neutral position. In light of our climate change emergency, it makes suggestions as how, as a council, or working with other partners, we could propose more water management measures. but that's only a suggestion, and it sets out the cost implications of that, how significant that would be. So in the local plan itself, we're proposing the same water consumption levels that we were in the current local plan of 110 litres per person. It's not for the local plan to set out targets for retrofitting. That would be through wider council initiatives or working with other partners, with other funding streams, maybe with housing associations, maybe with water companies. So the local plan isn't making recommendations in that respect. But the water cycle study does address the fact that we are in an area of water shortage and what options could be available to ensure that all new development could achieve a water neutral situation. But they're quite onerous. If we wanted all new development to still be water neutral across the borough, that's quite onerous. So it's not recommending that we do that because there's significant cost implications, there's significant logistical issues with that.
Thank you. Councillor Cubitt, please.
I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman, but I am not happy with a tick box exercise so that our officers can say that we've all discussed the water cycle study and it's a technical document and that we don't therefore need to deal with it in any more detail than the 4 paragraphs that are in this document. I don't know whether fellow members feel the same as me, but I'm lucky in that I've got a hard copy, but I know that a number didn't, and it wasn't in the agenda pack, so it hasn't been deemed to have been discussed anyways, other than the 4 paragraphs that are in here. And I kind of feel like we're the emperor with no clothes, right? I mean, you know, really? We know we have massive water problem. Really? We know we have a massive water problem. We have a massive water stress problem. And if you're going to tell your residents that we live in one of the wettest islands in the world, but because we're so incompetent on infrastructure, we're going to ration everybody in the south of England, and they're not going to be able to water their gardens, and they're not going to be able to flush their loos very effectively because they've got 3 bricks in it, so nothing goes down the toilet. And we can't cope with the poo that we've got already. But irrespective of the fact we can't cope with the poo we've got already, we're going to build another 17,800 houses. Our residents think we're completely mad. Completely mad. And I, for one, am not happy for us to say tonight, well, we've discussed the 4 paragraphs or whatever it is on page 47. Actually, it's more. It's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 6. We've discussed the 6, and that's it. Done. Job done. Great. Move on. So I don't know what other members feel.
Okay, so what are we actually suggesting, just to try and be clear here?
Well, I think that the Cabinet needs to go back to the drawing board. It needs to focus on what the residents elected them for. It should be working out how many houses we can actually build instead of going like some rat on a rat wheel, running and getting nowhere and exacerbating all the problems that we've got and not dealing with any of the problems we've got. We've got to start facing the music. We got elected by residents who live here today. And I just think that this is the definition of madness, really, to continue. So I would like to stop discussing Reg 18. I would like a special meeting for us, the members, to discuss technical documents that we deem to be important to our residents. And one of them is water cycle study. Another is the transport study. And that we address the infrastructure deficit that we have as well. So the emperor with no clothes, oh yeah, well, we'll get the school because the Section 106 money is going to come in. Oh yeah, we'll get the road. But the roads never come, the schools never come. And the last infrastructure report I've got, we've got a deficit of 190 million. And has anybody done the current calculation for infrastructure deficit? Because this was done in 2015. Because don't tell me we've raised 190 million and met our needs. In fact, the overall total infrastructure cost was 247,655,197, and the overall infrastructure funding shortfall was 190 million. And that's a council document. So, I don't know. I mean, I'm obviously happy to be guided by the rest of the members, but I think this is just not what our residents elected us to do.
Thank you, Councillor Cubitt. I've got a number of speakers, okay, that have all put their hands up together. Okay, I've got Councillor Adji Peter, Councillor Tomlin, Councillor McIntyre, I've got Councillor Laura James, I've got Councillor Kotecha, I've got Councillor McCormack. Have I missed anybody out?
Everybody.
Okay, so if we can just go through that list before we do anything else. So, Councillor Peter, please.
Thank you, Chair. So we all have been waiting for this water cycle study report. We thought it will be a evidence-based scientific report. So we now heard from the experts that it is not at all a scientific evidence-based report. It is like, what I found is, it's like a water facility management report. So my question is, are we going to rely on this document or this study report to improve our water quality or to sort out our river quality issues? If we do that, I'm 100% sure we are not going to reach anywhere. On a day-by-day basis, our water quality will keep on failing. So, yeah, that's my question basically.
Thank you very much, Councillor Peter. Councillor Tomlin, please.
Thank you, Chair. Well, actually, the very first part that Councillor Peters referred to, that it was quite an eye-opener from David George that this is not a scientific report, it's set criteria working on permit and discharge levels. Now, you know, an eye-opener to me. I have read the report. And the bottom line, I mean, you heard from one of the speakers, Mr. Chris Flukes, you know, we've got simple little small rivers, 5 hours every day discharging sewage into the streams that head their way. We're in a problem now. And we've got in 8.4 on page 48, it just says, you know, with the implementation of the necessary process upgrades, you know, we'll basically be able to meet the water standards for sewage. And then we get 8.6, the water supply, we've heard that. We're going to get our Thames Water and South East Water and Southern Water, rather, are going to put in this strategic demand management options. I mean, the bottom line there is we are going to rely on the sewage and our water supply of plans of a third party who have never delivered on time. We in Bramley have been waiting 2 or 3 years for works, to sewage works. They haven't got the money. Basingstoke is not a special case for them. They've got this problem all over the southern part. Well, their whole area is the southern part of England. We've heard we have a water shortage. We are in deep trouble. And then in the report, this 110 litres per day recommendation with a 62 litre per person per day target, if we could do it, when the average currently is 180 litres per person. This is like telling people to get on their push bikes, people to put their car in the garage. How are we going to achieve it? And it's, to me, we can't just say it's somebody else's problem, they'll deal with it, so let's get on and build the houses. We had a council motion that said infrastructure first. Now, whether we can actually make them do it, but we've said we want the infrastructure first, and we should stick to that. So that's my 5 pennyworth. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Tomlin. Okay. Councillor McIntyre, please.
Thank you, Chairman. I'm going to deviate a little bit from the room here because I actually found the water cycle study quite professionally put out. What I didn't... What I disagreed with, perhaps, was some of the emotional comments within the room, talking about water rationing and that's it all across the South Country. We can't flush our toilets and can't fill the bath and whatnot. Because that's not how I read the report at all. So I'm going to pull out a couple of things. Page 70. Since development within the study area is not proposed to exceed that for which both South East Water and Southern Water are planning, it is not necessary to evaluate the impacts of water supply in the study area independently of the water management plan and their assessments. What that's telling me is that the authors of the study have relied on the water firms, Southern Water and South East Water, and their water management plans. Now, I had a look at the Southern Water Management Plan, written in 2019, and the probability that they're talking about. So what they talk about here is that the Water Management Plan identifies that the western area, which includes the Kingsclear WRZ, does not have sufficient water for the whole of the planning period to meet its customers' need. Now, they have some mitigations and some plans in place for that. And really what they're talking about, temporary use bans and drought orders, which in layman's terms are hosepipe bans and non-essential use ban. So it's not, for us to sit and tell all our residents that's it, this local plan update is going to impose water rationing across the borough, is actually, we're doing a disservice to our residents. We're getting far too emotional with this, and what we need to do is look at the actual evidence base. Southern Water say the probability of a temporary use ban is 10%. That's in the next 10 years, it's only going to happen once. A drought order, and this is in the report 2019, the drought order, probability of 5%. That's one in the next 20 years that the chances of this are going to happen. Now, obviously, anything that we can put in place, and looking at the water cycle study and listening to the expert, but we're coming up with mitigations and ideas of how we can do this. Now, I'm not for the number that's been proposed, by the way, so I'm not trying to support that. I'm simply trying to look at this from an evidence-based approach. And the other thing that I did pull out of the water cycle study, and this is where I want to ask the planning officers on this, was page 83, which talks about the water cycle study recommendations, and section 8.1 wastewater. What it says, it talks about where we're looking to develop in areas to have consultation with Thames Water, Southern Water regarding that wastewater treatment capacity and the outcome of consultation prior to development approval. Then what happens is where there is uncertainty from Thames Water and Southern Water that the necessary capacity is available, a Grampian condition could be imposed prohibiting development authorised by the Planning Permission or other aspects linked to the Planning Permission. My question to the planning officers is that a fairly sound condition that we could impose, where if we identify areas that we are going to build on, because we do have to build some houses at some time, and if we work out that the capacity isn't there just yet, can we stop that development happening until it's put in place? Because that's what I read from the water cycle study.
Thank you. Yes, there's a couple of issues here in that the recommendation refers to the need for pre-application consultation with water companies. Now, a policy requirement for that is difficult to sustain at appeal because it's the outcome that you want to ensure rather than the process. So our website currently encourages pre-application consultation with utility providers, and for major schemes we consult water companies. I know it's something that some water companies are pushing for, Grampian conditions that if the infrastructure isn't in place, that until there's, it will be conditional, occupancy is conditional on their infrastructure being in place. Ultimately, it is the requirement of the water company to provide and treat water. It's the Water Industry Act that they have to do that. I'm aware of some developers that will challenge legal Grampian conditions if they're not very strongly justified. So I think it's difficult for us to have a policy in place that requires pre-application consultation because it's difficult to refuse something just on the basis you've got to have the outcome. But we would consider grampian conditions. I understand they have taken place. We have implemented some already if the infrastructure is being phased, particularly for larger schemes.
Just very quick supplementary.
Yeah, so as a very quick follow-up, could the evidence base from the water cycle study be used as that justification for the grampian condition? In other words, here's the numbers, we've done the study, we've done the report, this needs to be in place.
The water cycle study and various other processes and opportunities give the water companies quite advanced notice of what's needed. So for their infrastructure planning, they're meant to factor that in. So we have made the Environment Agency aware of this, we've made water companies aware of this. So it shouldn't be any surprise, but as we've heard earlier today, we are aware that water companies don't want to commit to infrastructure unnecessarily. All of their investment and infrastructure decisions have got to be subject to impact on customer prices. They're under strict price controls, Ofwat controls, so they don't want to be providing infrastructure unnecessarily. Nevertheless, obviously, we want to ensure that infrastructure is provided alongside development and in time for development to be occupied. So it shouldn't be any surprise to water companies when where development is coming on stream. They look at our AMR, they look at development briefs, and they're consulted on larger planning applications. So it shouldn't be any surprise, but there could be occasions if the water company says, look, we're going to provide, we have to provide it, they will provide it, but significant infrastructure is needed, we're doing this is our timing for it. And if that's an agreement potentially with developers, then it would be appropriate to impose conditions.
Thank you. I just have one question, if I can interject. On page 49 or 23 of 27, 8.6, okay, it's written in the plan, and I quote, adequate water supplies will be available up to 2039, okay, and will cater for the proposed levels of growth. Okay, wonderful statement, but how do you square that with the recommendation in the water cycle of, possibly imposing grampian conditions?
Well, this is for the supply of water, and it's saying that there is sufficient supply. The grampian conditions is on water treatment, so it's regarding the flow permits and what might need to be done to improve the capacity of wastewater treatment works. So that's wastewater treatment works. This is for water supply.
Okay, I sometimes, I think that obviously with things like this is why we need to, have a debate on the water cycle study. Okay, and I'll leave that one there. Okay, Councillor Kotechka, please. Sorry, I've mangled your name every single time I've said it, so I do apologise.
No problems. You can call me Councillor Samir if it makes it easier. How can I put this? It's like this has been wrapped up under a Christmas tree, and you're expecting a really good Christmas present, and they try to sort of present this where it's wrapped up in a paper which is covered with diamonds, and when you open it up, you realise that it doesn't make sense. I mean, without the water cycle report, how can you make this decision? Without the transport report, you can't make this decision. And even all the arguments or debates we've had this evening, we're talking about problems with the supply of water. My fellow councillor said, he mentioned 10 years. Basingstoke's going to be around more than 10 years. So if we're just doing that, then what happens in the next 10 years' time? Has anyone ever lived in a part of the world where there is shortage of water? How people suffer, how residents suffer? It's not only about, because, okay, there's shortage of water, we can't clean our clothes, but there's other parts of it as well. That means you cut down on certain cooking. That means you cut down on cleaning your sort of clothes. And more to that, as I made an example, it also affects certain businesses. And when it's a warm sort of part of the year, can you imagine someone said, by the way, rationing water, you can only have 1 shower a day, or you can't flush your loos. It's going to be a stinking situation on there, that part. So for that reason, I just cannot see how we can support 17,500 houses. It's not only that, as I said, we've also putting a climate emergency in. How can we sort of do this? We need to look at this report and look into this further. I just cannot support this. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Samir. Okay, Councillor McCormack, please.
Thank you, Chair. Well, are we going to be going on to look at other things like the transport assessment? I mean, we've spent a long time on the water cycle study, in which case we might end up having to have another meeting. But I think I have concerns over the water cycle study and the not being able to square the evidence presented about raw discharge of sewage into the Loddon with what's been stated in the water cycle study, and the fact that water companies appear reluctant and are attempting to justify what they call investment that they don't want to do. Well, they're private companies, of course they don't want to invest. But we've got national infrastructure obligations here, and if private companies do it, then there is a solution. It's to nationalise the water companies, and then they'll be under public control. Obviously, that's outside the scope of this document, but I think this plan is in such a state at the moment, I don't really have that much faith that we can deliver something that's actually going to meet residents' needs in terms of sewage. Setting aside nitrates and phosphates, discharge of raw sewage is of grave concern. And I do have other comments as well on the transport assessment. So I'm not sure where we're at the moment in debating this. I would like to give this some more debate than what we're like. I mean, we did say we're going to carry on till 10. We're past 10 now. But certainly just on the water cycle alone, I'm finding it really hard to support this paper. And the choice in front of us is to note it. Well, I think we can't just note it and go along with it. I'm outraged, to be honest, that everything that we've said as a committee and as a council appears to have been ignored thus far in terms of just the housing totals alone. So, you know, if it was opportune for me to move to reject this paper at hand now, I would do so. Or if the committee's minded to discuss further evidence and then go for a rejection later on, I'm happy with either option.
Thank you very much, Councillor McCormack. Before we kind of go into anything, I do appreciate it's getting on towards 10 o'clock, which is where I said. I do actually have Councillor Laura James, please.
Thank you, Chair. I'd like to actually move a motion that this Reg 18 paper that we have in front of us tonight is premature, and I'd like to say that we need to have the water study come back. I know that, Joanne, that you say that we don't have those evidence-based documents. I've always said that we should have had them to this committee, all of those evidence-based documents that we discuss. I think that water study should come. I think we should take the offer from the conservation group from Whitchurch, and I'd like them to come forward. And I spoke to George before he left, and he said he could do that within a few weeks, that piece of work, and I think that would be useful for us to understand. I'd like to be able to ask questions of the water study. I don't have a hard copy of the water study, and so I've really struggled, and I've struggled tonight, so I can't reference the document, and I think we should be able to do that. I'd like to see the transport study. I think it's important that we see that. We'll have a discussion about that. I'm also concerned that we didn't have the policies that we had discussed earlier. I'd like to see those before they go out. I'd like to see the changes and that you took on board those changes. You said that you have. I don't know how much of those changes you've taken on board. We're being asked to support an options paper before us tonight, or to note an options paper. I'm not confident that I can note that. How can we possibly say that we support this development or that development when we don't have this evidence. And I think that we're all feeling very uncomfortable with this. I urge us to pause, to take a step back. This is too premature. I think that you've got to take the members with you, and you don't have that support here.
Thank you very much.
I'm asking.
Yeah, I understand that. Okay, thank you, Councillor James. Okay, I just want to make sure that I got the motion down correctly that you're suggesting. Okay, that you're suggesting that we adjourn tonight. Okay, and that we reconvene to debate the water study. Okay, and the work with David George's group, okay, which is the conservation group of Whitchurch, okay, and we also need to debate the transport study. Is that correct? And also see the policies that we did say were actually going to be circulated around, okay, so we can have a look at the track changes in that. Is that correct?
Yeah, and I also think that as part of this piece of work, we need to understand if, for any reason, there was, in relation to the exceptional circumstances, there was a change, what happens to the document that we've got before us? Does it change at all? So say suddenly the government say, yes, we accept your exceptional circumstances, or Gove suddenly has this change of heart, what happens to the document we have in the format it is? Because obviously there's no numbers attached to it, but we do have all of the sites. So I'd like to understand that. I just think that there's a need to do more work. I think that I have never been comfortable in the process so far. I think it's been very poor. I didn't like the way that we were being managed through this. I think that we need to take stock. And I think I would like us to look at some of this evidence, and particularly the water study, because there's so much concern from so many members, rural and urban. Is effectively what happens in relation to the exceptional circumstances, what happens to this document if things change. So there's no figure in there at the moment, but it's premised on the high number. So what do we do?
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, so there is a motion on the floor. Okay, just to clarify it, okay, that Councillor James is proposing a motion to say that this document is premature, and that we should debate the water cycle study, the transport assessment study, and also understand, okay, the special circumstances, okay, and how it would affect these documents, okay, with those exceptional circumstances. Okay, is that correct, Councillor James? Will that suffice? Okay, and also have sight of the and debate the tracked changes, okay, in the policies. Is that correct? Does everybody understand the motion that's presented? Yes, no? Okay, so who's in favour of the motion? Sorry, I beg your pardon. Okay, who'd like to second it? Councillor Tomlin, okay, had his hand up before. Sorry, Councillor McCoy. Okay, so who's in favour of this motion? Okay, that's carried unanimous. Okay, thank you very much. Okay, just hold on, please. Thank you, councillors. Okay, sorry, Councillor McIntyre, I'll come to you in a minute. Just very quickly, Councillor Laura James, we have Joe here that would like to just give a little bit of clarification on what would happen with the exceptional circumstances documents.
Just in terms of the exceptional circumstances, as I said earlier, we are continuing to look at that and work up evidence on that. Once the census information comes out, we have got experts already lined up to be looking at that, so that work will be happening as we move along. If things change on a national level, so after the census is released, or for any other reasons the government changes their approach, obviously we would take that into account and reflect that. So we wouldn't just continue regardless of what happens.
What I was meaning is we have a document with in the options of all this document here tonight before us, which is with all the sites within it. Say for some reason it came back and we could halve the number, and those sites have already been identified. I'd quite like to understand how vulnerable we are in relation to this going forward, because those have been identified and this piece of work has been done, and my concern is we will then see these come forward as windfall, and developers are going to bring them forward. And once this goes out as a public document, that's my concern, and I think that's a concern of lots of speakers tonight, how vulnerable we are to the market, really.
Okay, thank you very much for that. Do you want to come back on anything? Okay, we'll come back. Okay, what we'll do, members, is we will be back in touch with another meeting date, okay, where we can debate, okay, the water cycle study, the transport assessment, okay, look at the track changes, okay, and move on from there. Councillor Cubitt and then Councillor McIntyre, please.
Sorry, Councillor James makes a very good point, and I think what we need is a political statement from the Cabinet stating that this document has no bearing on our planning, on our local plan update. And that's the point she's getting at, because within it, embedded in it, even on the sites that are not being taken forward, there is language that is extremely unhelpful. And I'm telling you, extremely unhelpful is a polite way of me putting it.
Okay, thank you, Councillor Cubitt.
Thank you, Councillor Kirby. So we've been clear, and Joe and the officers been clear about in terms of the numbers, and this is the part of the process, and this is not a definitive at some point until we go to sort of a consultation and stamp by the council. So I'm happy to take that feedback, but I don't see the sort of a justification to say, okay, this doesn't have any bearing, because this doesn't have a bearing until it's gone to consultation.
So, Cabinet Member, thank you very much. And I hear and understand what you're saying, but the reality is we don't have a 5-year housing supply. And what we have now got is a document which a QC can use, even on sites that aren't in the allocations, right? So there are very unhelpful comments in there. And I think as members representing our residents, and I question the 5-year calculation as well, as Joanne knows, and I've sent you a lot of correspondence about the fact that I don't believe that we have got a 5-year shortfall. I think Hampshire County Council hasn't calculated it correctly. And I find it really loathsome that our whole borough is beholden to Hampshire County Council's calculations as to whether we've got a 5-year housing supply or not. I find it absolutely shocking, and it's another reason why I passionately believe in unitary authorities, for exactly that reason. We have no representation in the county. We're completely at hostage to their calculations as to how our sites are going to be delivered when they're not even a planning authority. And now we've got a document that weakens our case on loads of sites that aren't even being taken forward. They've been rejected by our officers, but unfortunately the language within it weakens our position in the event that we're taken to appeal.
Councillor Ganesh.
Thank you, Councillor Cubitt. Definitely note those points, and the 5-year land supply is something definitely up for a debate at some point, but this is not probably the point to go into more detail about it. But happy to take that point and discuss with my cabinet colleagues and come back to you. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. Finally, okay, and it is finally, okay, Councillor McIntyre had his hand up.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You did skip me before, so I won't be offended at all because I've got the final statement. All I want to make sure is that something in the motion that Councillor James proposed isn't missed out, which is the invitation to the Whitchurch Conservation Group to come to us as part of the next meeting to talk specifically about the work they're doing with the river test. And that piece, because I'd be very interested in that piece. And I'd also be very interested in having our water expert respond to that or feed into that report as well, because I think that'll absolutely help fill in some of the missing picture.
Sorry, can we have this on record, please?
Sorry, could we possibly have a come attend? Because they're the authors of the report, and that's how we've always operated historically. So when Halcro did it, 12, 13, 14, 15 years ago, they came and did a massive presentation and they enabled us to ask them all the questions.
We can ask them, and I'm quite happy, and I'm quite happy for them to attend. Okay. So what would members? We'll be back in touch with new meeting dates. Okay. I'd like to close the meeting. It's 10:15. Thank you very much.